Good morning, everyone, and welcome to SFEC's 2024 webinar series. I'm Lane Mosher. I'm a forester with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, and this month we get kind of a twofer. This will be our second webinar in as many weeks. And this time we have Christian Nelson with the Forest Stewards Guild talking about the Forestry for Minnesota Birds project and handbook. And Christian, I'll just throw to you. Feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lane, for giving me the opportunity to talk today. And thank you, 58 attendees and counting, for taking the time out of your day and your interest to attend this webinar today. Hopefully you can all see my screen and I'll get started. Again, I'm Christian Nelson. I'm the Lake States Coordinator with the Forest Stewards Guild. And let's see if I can go to the next slide. I'll just give a little bit of information about the Forest Stewards Guild. It's a nonprofit. It is located and headquartered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but you can see from the map with the little acorn leaf symbol, we have staff kind of scattered all over the US, up in Maine, Vermont, the Carolinas. I'm in Minnesota. Mike Lynch, the Forest Stewards Guild director for the Lake States, is down in Mankato. We've got folks in Washington and Oregon, Colorado. And essentially, the Forest Stewards Guild is a nonprofit that advocates for sustainable, ecologically based forestry and has their hands in a lot of different kinds of topics, including climate change, old growth forests, prescribed burning, sustainable forestry for the birds, not only a Minnesota effort, but there's a big Northwest US effort as well in Oregon and Washington. We're a membership-based group, so we have, I think, 400 some members that range anywhere from students to professors and professional foresters alike, and people with any kind of interest in forestry and ecological forestry. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about bird populations and why they're kind of on our radar, what the Forestry for Minnesota Birds program is all about, a little bit about the project history and who is working on this. So a little bit of behind the scenes, a little bit of content preview, and I'll tell you why that's a preview in a moment. A little bit about the forest habitat types that you'll find in the guidebook that we're developing, the birds that you'll find in the guidebook. And we're going to do something that I haven't done before, but we're going to try doing a sample assessment, sort of a kind of fake walk through the woods and see what the guidebook can do for us. So one of the things that has brought birds onto our radars is nothing new. It's well established and it's been known for quite some time, but North America as a whole has lost about 3 billion birds in total population, roughly 1 in 4 birds since about 1970. Over about 1 billion of these birds are forest birds. So there's definitely something going on, maybe locally, maybe internationally across the border, but it's not just long distance neotropicals that are declining. We're also seeing some declines in short distance migrants. These might be, say, Minnesota birds that go south for the winter, but still stay in the US. So Texas, Arizona, Florida, birds like that, and resident birds that are here year round. Some species are increasing, some are stable, and about a quarter of birds are still currently declining. There's a lot of different factors. Habitat loss on their breeding grounds is a big issue. So that might be in the southern US, or it could be Central and South America. Land cover fragmentation, changing forest demographics, so changes in the composition of forest, invasive species, both plant and animal and insects, climate change, declining insect populations, West Nile virus, things like power lines, cell phone towers, glass buildings, light pollution, predation's a big one. You can actually get some detailed information, including kind of which birds in Minnesota, especially in the Chippewa National Forest and the Superior National Forest, that have had long-time breeding bird population surveys. You can read that in the 2022 Forest Breeding Bird Annual Report, which is put out by the University of Minnesota's Natural Resource Research Institute. I'll talk a little bit about them later because they're key partners in this project. Minnesota is unique in that we have a tremendous amount of bird species richness. The red shade on this map are areas that have the highest forest bird species diversity. About 250 breeding birds have been identified in Minnesota, according to the latest 2024, I think, Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas that just came out. A really great book for those that are interested. You can order it. It's about $60. And I kind of joke that it's about $1 a pound because it is a large book. There's about 150 bird species in the forest bird species in Minnesota. And Minnesota has about 17.7 million acres of forest, so about a third of the state. One caveat about this map is that this is showing forest bird species richness. So if you see areas that look like they're particularly poor, for example, the Dakotas, Nebraska, that's just because they simply don't have that much forest. But pick an area that you know has quite a bit of forest, say the Southeast US or the Northwest of the US, and you can see that those areas have extensive forest, but they don't have the bird species richness that states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and some of the other Northeast states have. So we're in a really good position to help a lot of different birds. The Minnesota Forestry for Minnesota Birds is really more of a program than just a guidebook. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but essentially the program as a whole has a number of goals. The creation and or enhancement of bird habitat, to provide habitat and silvicultural recommendations, which are forest management recommendations for those that aren't foresters, for at-risk bird species, and also species that are just in decline. Maybe they're not at risk yet, but they're trending that way. To promote the connection between bird habitat and working woodlands, to collaborate and support others to bring foresters for the birds across the landscape. So in other words, get the word out and spread the message. One of the ways to do that would be to host educational workshops promoting the connection between bird habitat and working woodlands. And ultimately, the goal is to make meaningful, beneficial changes to on-the-ground forest management for the benefit of birds. Our intended audience for this program, especially for this guidebook that I'll be talking more about, primarily forest landowners and land managers. So that would include professional land managers, foresters, forestry consultants, private landowners, land conservancies, loggers. Also included in that group would be people affiliated with non-governmental organizations, NGOs, private land interests. And ultimately, we're trying to address all these diverse audiences with a single publication. Some states have chosen to create two, one that kind of has more technical jargon, one that's a little bit more friendly to those that aren't familiar with that technical jargon. We try to find a balance between technical jargon, really trying to eliminate it and speak in terms that still mean something to professional foresters, but also still mean something to non-professional foresters alike. It's possible that in the future we'll create pocket guides that are a little bit more focused on maybe different forest habitat types, or maybe have some of that technical jargon added back in to address a professional audience. But ultimately, again, our goal is to promote forest management techniques that benefit birds across Minnesota, and by raising awareness of the problem and offering helpful solutions. So what are we producing? We're producing and I'll have some sort of content previews. We're producing a guidebook, currently weighing in around 60 pages, but we'll see what happens when the graphic designer and the images get put into it and it gets finalized. It'll probably grow a little bit, but ultimately it's going to have forest management and silvicultural guidelines. It'll have 4 major forest types representing Minnesota's forests, broken down into 7 subtypes that better reflect forest management changes. I'll talk more about that. Some major threats, including climate change and insects and disease. There will be individual bird species habitat needs accounts for 18 focal birds. They include neotropical migrants, so birds that spend time in Central and South America in the winter. Short distance migrants, again, those are birds that are still in the US, but the southern US generally. And resident birds, birds that are here year round. And also some game species. Not because game species are necessarily different, but because game species are a way to sort of engage landowner or a group that might not otherwise be interested in other types of birds. Um, Information about other non-wildlife, non-bird wildlife, I should say, that may benefit from bird-friendly management. So we wanted to make sure that not only are we helping bird habitat, but the changes that we're making would be beneficial to everything that lives in the woods. And ultimately, the goal of this overall program is, again, not only just this guidebook, but also getting out there, spreading the message, educating people in person and in the field, workshops, field tours, things like that. So it'll look like something like this. Again, this is a guidebook that is in the process of being finalized. We're still working with, just about to start working with our graphic designer. So I don't have a cover that I can show yet, but it'll look something like this. And this is an example of many other states that have done similar projects. So some of the most recent ones down in the lower center, Forestry for Birds, Western Oregon. That was a Forest Stewards Guild led effort, very recent in the Pacific Northwest, specifically Oregon. And then also pretty recent is a publication done in Michigan, two publications actually. They're one of the groups that chose to make two different guidebooks, one addressing a professional audience and one for more of the layman landowner. And then a few other states. And I think one of the reasons why Minnesota is a little bit behind in getting something like this done is because generally I think Minnesota forestry is ahead of the curve in general. We've been doing ecologically focused silviculture for a long time. I know some of my earliest trainings were way back in 2006, and it had already been going on for a few years at that point. So I think Minnesota's been a progressive forestry state, but there's still some room and still definitely an audience that we can reach with something like this. So I'm not going to go over all of this, but I just kind of wanted to talk about how this particular effort has been going on for a few years. In 2008, some of the first Forestry for the Birds guidebooks were developed in states like Vermont and Maine. And then in 2008 and going forward, several other states developed their own types of publications: Indiana, Maine, Michigan, Oregon, Pennsylvania. In 2018, the Forest Stewards Guild actually organized a webinar featuring a Vermont program. That kind of led to some discussion that, hey, we should develop something like this in Minnesota. There was a few efforts to procure funding for the effort. That didn't go anywhere at the time. Flash forward a few years. Peter Deezer, who I think I saw was a participant on this call from the American Bird Conservancy, and Peg Robertson from the U.S. Forest Service, rekindled some of that effort. In comes Mike Lynch, the Forest Stewards Guild Lake States director, and they all sort of partnered up to write some grants and pursue a different funding mechanism that ultimately was able to hire me, and also a coordinator that's based in Wisconsin, but sort of working in Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Michigan, and put on a number of webinars. If you're interested in some of the webinars that she's been doing, look up the Forest Bird Network. I'm not going to go over all these slides either, but this is our working group. And you can see that we have had a lot of different partners involved in parts of or all of the process, including before I was hired on, to sort of start brainstorming what we might be producing, what might be in it. So I'll just mention some key people again: Peter Deezer with the American Bird Conservancy, and Jamie Strange with a Northern Forest Bird Network. That's what you'd want to look at if you're going to try to find their YouTube channel. And not mentioned so far, but Natural Resource Research Institute's Alexis Grindy and Josh Bedner with the Avian Ecology Research Lab have been very helpful. There's also DNR staff, Forest Service staff, and a bunch of others that you can see on here that have all been great in bringing ideas and feedback to this whole process. A little bit about the funding. Ultimately, money comes from the APA, Environmental Protection Agency, that then goes to the Great Lakes Restoration effort, or initiative rather, that then sort of gets funneled to the Upper Mississippi Great Lakes Joint Venture, which is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service entity that ultimately is a collection of many different groups. And um, that money then got sort of subawarded to the American Bird Conservancy, which then got subawarded to the Forest Stewards Guild. So that's kind of where the funding has come from. And without it, this wouldn't be possible. So we're very grateful to the entire chain that has allowed this to happen. And keep losing my arrow buttons. This is a text heavy slide. I kind of like to have my PowerPoint stand alone if they're ever distributed and my talk's not associated with it. So it kind of breaks some rules. But this is a little bit about what you would find if you were to grab a copy that's not yet available. It's coming soon. Basically a recap of why the project's important and what is going on with birds. So a case for why this is important. Another sort of case for deliberate goal-oriented forest management versus doing nothing. And sometimes doing nothing is the appropriate action to take, but there's a difference between intentionally doing nothing and doing nothing because you haven't paid attention to it, if you can catch that difference. And so we try to make an argument for the good that can kind of come from forest management and what you can do to benefit birds and other creatures and the trees themselves and your economic situation, things like that. You'll find information about Minnesota's biogeography and bird species diversity. So that might be kind of interested in if you're just curious about aspects of the forests and sort of a little bit about the history that created them and sort of how they're distributed across the state. Different threats to bird populations. Again, who developed this and how it can help you manage your forests. 18 bird species, which I'll be talking about, and a lot of elements associated with those bird species. Native plant community systems, which will help you sort of understand a little bit about the systems that forests operate under. Forest habitat types, talk about that later. Landscape level considerations. This would be sort of looking at the broader area around a given forest type or a given stand rather. So really looking at what's around the piece of property that you're sort of looking to do something with and factoring that into your decision-making process. Stand level features. So those are at the individual forest level that you're looking at. A little bit about forest management, silvicultural recommendations, and there's some extensive resources that are available as well that are in an appendix that would be very useful for bird ID and biology and other resources for landowners, like maybe tax incentive programs and how to find a forester, things like that. What our program ultimately is not, it's not a substitute for working with a professional forester. It will definitely arm you with some good information and some interest, hopefully, and some ideas. And our goal is hopefully landowners will bring this to a forester that they're working with, and foresters will bring this to landowners that they're working with. So really a document that can sort of pick interest and deliver content and information to both parties. And it's not supposed to be a replacement for more focused information such as bird ID. There's whole books dedicated to bird ID and apps and websites. Some are linked in our further resources section. It's not a replacement for forest management techniques because it's not going to be in depth like you might find in a textbook or some other guidelines. Climate change information is, a brief summary, but there are extensive publications, websites, and articles about climate change. It's not a substitute for best management practices, laws, rules, or regulations, etc., things like that. So what is the scope of the publication we're looking at? It's basically the forested areas of Minnesota, which is on this Minnesota map on the left, would be basically everything that's either dark green or sort of a lighter green color. And these would be bird conservation zones 12 and 23. These are developed by the North American Bird Conservative Initiative, but they're basically maps that sort of group similar ecotypes into areas that sort of share features that are important to birds. So in the process of trying to figure out how to make this guidebook, and with Minnesota having, what did I say, over 17.5 million acres of forests, and several different biomes coming together, it was kind of a head scratcher on how we could break that down and simplify it as much as possible into something that would make sense, be readable, and still be relevant at the biological level of birds. And so we had to think about what are the meaningful differences to birds, because birds don't necessarily see the forest the same way that a professional forester, for example, might. They seem to be more interested in the sort of composition, structure, and age of a forest a little bit more than individual species. Um, but we still wanted to have our forest types be translatable to professional foresters that are actually going to do some of this management work and write the plans. Um, Also have it understandable and relatable to landowners. And ultimately, we wanted to make sure that whatever we produce can tie into and again be translated to different things that are available in the state. For example, Minnesota has a very robust ecological classification system and a lot of information tied to it. It kind of provides a common language for foresters to think and work in, and look things up in and communicate. And so I think we managed to accomplish that. So here are the 4 types and the 7 subtypes that the group has come up with, and basically summarizes Minnesota's over 17.5 million acres of forest. So we've got lowland conifers. These are black spruce bogs, northern white cedar bogs and swamps, tamarack bogs, things like that. Lowland hardwoods. These would be black ash, the depressional wetlands that are kind of unique to Minnesota. It's not that Minnesota is the only state that has black ash, but we do kind of have some unique depressional wetland geography that leads to black ash, essentially monoculture forested wetlands. We also have a bottomland type. These would be sort of riparian areas around major rivers and streams. Species like American elm, black and green ash, cottonwood, silver maple would inhabit these types of floodplain forests. We have a very broad group called upland deciduous and mixed conifer. And although some birds might treat some of these areas the same to be translatable to forest management techniques and foresters, we broke this down into a couple different subtypes. So the very common and ubiquitous aspen birch subtype, especially in northern Minnesota, this has got quaking aspen and paper birch primarily. The oak subtype, um, kind of self-explanatory, but bur oak, red oak, white oak, things like that. You find a lot of that in the center part of the state and down in the southeast. And the northern hardwood subtype, these are going to be sugar maple, basswood, yellow birch type forests, very rich soils, very beautiful forests, especially this time of the year. Actually, they're all kind of beautiful this time of the year, but northern hardwoods are especially colorful. Um, and finally, upland conifer. These would be jack pine, red pine, white pine. They have different types of biology and silvics associated with each of those species, but they're lumped basically into an upland pines type, essentially. So, okay, so now we have forests. What birds do we want to represent that live in each of those forest types? And we started with about 250 species to look at that breed in Minnesota. And so we whittled that down pretty quickly to about 150 species that are specifically Minnesota forest birds. The other 100 birds are found more in prairies, grasslands, and things like that. We wanted birds that had a pretty wide geographic distribution. So chances are that whatever we write, you'll find that bird in most of the state, not necessarily just one corner of it. It's not perfect, the birds that we chose, because we did want some birds that are maybe underrepresented to be in our guidebook, but we did a pretty good job. We want habitat specialists, not such a habitat specialist. You only find it in one very specific type of woods, where a publication where we're really trying to address a broad audience across Minnesota. We wanted to make sure that the birds could be found in most woods across the state as much as possible, but not so general that the birds are just inhabiting everything. A robin is a very generalist bird that could be found in the woods and in your backyard and kind of a mix of places. That might be just a little bit too generalist. We wanted to mix a relatively common and conservation need species. So the conservation need species, kind of obvious, we want to help birds that are declining, that have been recognized to be declining, or have declined already and are in peril in some way. But again, we wanted some birds that were a little bit more common so that the average person using this would stand a chance of actually seeing it, and it wouldn't be so rare that only a few people see it maybe in a year. We wanted birds that respond to sort of forest management actions. So when you make changes in the woods, you might see changes in how those birds use that woods. Relatively easy to ID. So the process we used was establish the forest habitat types and then find birds that would sort of meet that selection criteria. And so we chose 18 birds. And for reference, other states have anywhere from 10 to maybe 20. I think the average is a little bit lower, but we felt, and it made sense because Minnesota is a very forested state with very different forests. So we have a lot of just natural biological variability. And so you can see that we have, or the way I have this list written up is we've got birds that represent each of the forest habitat types and subtypes. I'm not going to read them all, but the birds that you see in bold text are birds of species of greatest conservation need in Minnesota. So these are birds that Minnesota recognizes are definitely declining, have declined, and that Minnesota might play an important habitat element for these birds. There are other birds that might not necessarily be doing so poorly in Minnesota, but nationally or internationally across sort of North America, they are declining, and those might be reflected in something I'll talk about a little bit later. But the partners in flight concern score, conservation score, but those are written up in the guidebook as well. So some of the birds that maybe aren't a Minnesota problem might be a national problem. But you can see it's a pretty good mix. Some of these birds, hopefully you've heard of some of these birds, and some maybe are new to you. So hopefully it's a little bit of a mix. Here's a little bit of a content preview. This is pulled out of Michigan's Forest Owners Guidebook. The reason why it's pulled out of Michigan's book is because we are just about to start working with our graphic designer. And so if I was to show you a preview of what I have right now, it's not nearly as pretty, but it's going to look something like this. So you can see it's pretty condensed information. So in this example, this is looking at a wood thrush, and it's got some information about what kind of forest it lives in, how to ID it, what it sounds like, where it nests and what the nest looks like, what type of food it eats, how big of a territory it might have, how susceptible it is to climate change. And then also it has some notable habitat features and management recommendations. And then if I can bring your attention down to the little graphic, the little woods graphic on the lower left, that kind of shows you where this bird nests and spends its time foraging. So in this example, this wood thrush spends most of its time in this middle band. This is called the mid-story. Hopefully you can see my mouse cursor, but other birds might spend their time up in the treetops foraging, and maybe they nest on the ground or things like that, or maybe they nest in a cavity. So we have content like this for all of our 18 birds. And we also have information. This is another Michigan example, but we also have information from Michigan's guidebook. Again, Minnesota is going to look similar for what the forest subtypes and habitat types are going to look like. So information about the ecology, kind of what tree species are in these types, a little bit about other wildlife that inhabit these types of forests, climate change, vulnerability with whole forest types, based on different types of models, what species might do better or fare worse under a changing, presumably warmer climate, with different levels of precipitation. You can see some other birds that might live in these forest types as well as some additional wildlife species that I mentioned. So you're going to see something similar. Again, this is from Michigan, but you're going to see something similar in Minnesota. What we have just isn't pretty yet, but it's getting there. Lastly, for the previews from Michigan's guidebook are some stand level considerations. So this is at the individual forest type. So this might be something in your backyard. If you're a professional landowner, this might be a given stand that you're in charge of managing for the landowner or agency that you work for. But there are some key components in every forest stand that are important, especially to birds. And so we have highlighted those, helped define those, and talked about why they're important to birds. And so we're going to go through a sample exercise and sort of look at some of these things. But if you are not familiar with forestry, a lot of these terms might be new, and this will be great information. And if you're a professional forester, you maybe have not thought about some of these elements and their importance to birds. So although the terms might not be necessarily new, maybe you'll learn something a little bit about how birds utilize some of these different features. So just ahead of doing a sample exercise, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the process of sort of starting to develop and think about doing something with a given stand. And it starts with basically trying to decide what your ultimate goal is for a given piece of property. So for this sample exercise that we're about to do, I'm going to pretend that the forest owner has a northern hardwood stand, so sugar maple, yellow birch, basswood type forest, and they are interested in tapping maple trees for syrup. So a sugar bush, that's called. And so we're going to pretend that's our goal. Sometimes you might not know your goal until you know a little bit about more of what you have and what's there, and you speak with a professional forester, a consulting forester, or read a publication like this and start to sort of develop ideas. So this is the first step, but there's some back and forth that maybe helps inform one step to the next. So after you sort of have sort of figured out that maybe you want to do something and you've got some goals, now you have to go look at the forest. That's what we're going to sort of pretend to do in a minute here. Assess what you have, what kind of condition it's in, what's there, what could be better, especially in terms of birds. This is kind of managing with birds in mind. You want to determine sort of what you want that forest to look like and how you're going to get there. So you're going to step forward there is create or modify a plan. So that's a little bit about how you're going to actually implement the changes that you want to see. Step 5 is kind of taking the principles that are in this guidebook and sort of incorporating those into your management plan. So ultimately, your management plan may or may not be ultimately focused on birds, but there are elements that you can do and small changes to your forest management plan that might be more bird friendly that you hadn't thought of before. Small changes that maybe won't ultimately impact your final decision or the economics behind it or the logistics. And then lastly, usually you want to go into a forest that has had management activities and sort of assess, did we reach our goal or did we reach step 1 of our goal? Because you might actually have a very long-term vision and adjust your plan accordingly and sort of go back and just sort of cycle through 1 through 6, 1 through 6, and not necessarily in that order. They can sort of play off each other. So, okay, so I mentioned we are going to pretend to take a walk. Here's our fake forest. I wish I could like have a video game and we could like really pretend to walk it, but this is the only image you're going to see of our pretend forest. But we're going to pretend this is a northern hardwood stand, a sugar maple stand primarily, and we're going to think about it in terms of we want to make a sugar bush, but we want to do it in a way that as long as we're there, we can maybe make it ideal habitat for a given bird species. And so pretend this is our woods and we're going to walk into it. And I'm going to show you, hopefully this screen share works. Lane, if you could tell me if you can see my next set of slides.
Yep. Right now we're looking at the just the PowerPoint as it's closed.
Oh, do you see a forest habitat assessment worksheet, I hope?
No, we do not.
Oh, okay. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and try to reshare a different thing. How's that?
Now we see the kind of the top half of the sheet, it looks like.
Okay, perfect. I have it extra wide, so it's easy,
Perfect.
more easily readable. So this is found in the guidebook, and it's something that ultimately we hope to sort of have in maybe a PDF, fillable PDF, Google Sheet. We kind of want to get it out there in a couple different formats, but ultimately this is going to end up in the guidebook, which will hopefully be a PDF and a hard copy print version for those that want that. So you can make your own copies out of it, or again, hopefully we'll be able to host these things on our website so that as you want them, you can download them and utilize them for your own purposes. So we're actually going to go through sort of a sample. So I'm going to sort of scroll through this part that's not filled out and just give you a sense of what it looks like when it's blank. And then I'll explain a little bit more as we walk through it. So that's the first page. This is the second page. So it's 2 pages, a front and a back. And the idea behind this worksheet is that you're going to go into the woods and look at the habitat elements that are most important to birds. So this is an example of a fake sheet, and we're time travelers too, because apparently I filled this out June 1st, 2025. And the property name is a really lovely property called Sample Forest. Um, Maybe we can call it the Sample Forest to make it sound a little bit more exotic. It's 10 acres. Our fake northern hardwood stand here is 10 acres. So that's all stuff that you might know your stand size. You might be able to go on Google Earth and sort of draw a polygon around it and get the number of acres it is. There are a number of ways that you can sort of figure out what your stand size are if you don't know it off the top of your head or don't have other means of just figuring that out. And then as you walk through the forest, you're going to be looking at what species are there. So we have dominant overstory tree species. I mentioned sugar maple and basswood are dominant species. And then using the guidebook, you can then say, okay, I have sugar maple and basswood. Maybe I don't know that that's a northern hardwood stand. I can then sort of read through the forest habitat types and subtypes and go, oh, this really sounds like the description for a northern hardwood stand. So I must be in this upland deciduous mixed conifer, and it's a northern hardwood subtype. So from that, you're going to be able to get some information about that forest habitat type, some silviculture associated with it, some wildlife species. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. Um, Kind of estimate maybe the height of the trees in feet if you know it. It's not super important necessarily, but if you can just sort of estimate how tall it is, how many times could you stand on your own head or something, however you have to do it. A professional forester might use a device like a clinometer to do it. The average diameter of a tree, this is basically typically measured at about chest height. And it's just, if you held a ruler up to it, if your tree is about the length of your 1 foot ruler, you've got a 12-inch diameter tree. Sometimes you might know the age. A lot of times you might not. If you're a professional forester, there are tools you can use, an increment board to count the annual rings. Or if you had a tree cut down, you can sort of count the rings that way. Or you can leave it blank. The native plant community system, you can figure that out by reading the descriptions, and then filling in that that you're in a mesic hardwood forest. That will then allow you to not only read a little bit about that native plant community system in the guidebook, but then also reference other sites that are included in the guidebook. Minnesota DNR, for example, has a lot of information that ultimately will help give you even more detailed information about maybe the stand's history, some of the ecological processes and disturbance regimes that sort of keep those systems going, the trajectory of those types of systems. You can look at some specific climate change vulnerabilities. If you're thinking about planting trees, you can use the native plant community. If you can drill down to the native plant community level, not the systems level. Forget the exact terminology there. but that will inform you on maybe suitable tree choices and things like that. So all kinds of information can come from that if you can figure that out. And then the next element, so that's all kind of like big picture, descriptive stuff that describes the stand that you're in. So in this case, our northern hardwood stand. Now you're going to sort of start walking around the stand and estimating some different elements. So we're going to start looking at gaps. These are defined in the book a little bit more, so you don't need to know exactly what this is just from this worksheet. It's explained in more detail in the guidebook. We start looking at canopy gaps, basically where the crowns of trees aren't necessarily touching, but there's holes in them, gaps that allow basically additional sunlight to reach the forest floor that would otherwise be blocked by the big overstory trees. Gaps are important, as are explained in the book, because they often provide different types of microhabitats because of the additional light and sometimes the additional rainfall and things like that, that those gaps end up providing sort of a different species mix of understory plants. They might provide an area for tree seedlings to grow a little bit faster and get established. Some species that are a little bit more shade intolerant, so they like sunlight, will thrive in those gaps, and they won't thrive necessarily in the darker, more shaded woods. And birds will use gaps because they will use them because of the diversity in different types of plants that might exist in those. They might use those sites because of the different types of vertical structure. So you might have a relatively park-like forest, for example, and then in these gaps, you'll kind of have this area sort of thicker, taller, sort of mid-height type plants and shrubs and things like that. Maybe they're fruit-bearing. They might provide cover for feeding, for nesting, or they might provide sort of the openings that some birds will use to actually fly in, grab insects that are currently flying, and kind of zip back into the woods for cover. So small gaps, medium gaps, large gaps, all defined by sort of how large they are. So you're going to kind of walk through and define those. Professional foresters might have a different way of sort of reaching this same information, where you would get things like the number of gaps per acre and things like that, a little bit more methodical methods to do that. So this is kind of the layman's version. And really this whole habitat assessment worksheet should kind of not necessarily be an end of itself for a professional forester, but an idea to sort of either incorporate it into the normal field work that you would do to modify some of your procedures, or you can sort of grab this and use this as is and use it to help inform your professional forester decisions too. Quickly, we're also going to look at the average canopy cover in the stand, overstory, midstory, understory, again, defined in the book, kind of looking at how the different vertical layers of the forest are laid out. These are important elements to birds who see forests very structurally and not so much by species. We're going to look at softwood inclusions. So these are conifers, essentially, balsam fir, pine, spruce. Very important to many birds to have these little pockets, and some other wildlife to have these little pockets. In this fake stand of ours, we're saying that we didn't find any. So it's basically just a sugar maple, basswood, yellow birch, and some other species, but we didn't see pines or spruces or firs. Now we're going to look at snags. We're going to walk around and see, do we have small trees, standing dead trees, large standing dead trees? And then we're going to look at the quality of the snags, which is largely defined by how rot resistant they are and how likely they are to remain standing for a long time. And there is a list of those species at the bottom of this worksheet. We're about to see it. Actually, no, it's the bottom of the second page, and also in the guidebook itself. Snags are really important because a number of birds not only eat the insects that are inhabiting some of these standing dead trees, but a lot of our, I think, 29 species of birds use cavities, so holes in trees. Woodpeckers being an obvious one, but there's some warbler species that do as well, chickadees, wrens, things like that. We're going to look at downed wood on the ground. So these are just big logs laying on the ground. It might be small diameter stuff. It might be bigger stuff. I think a lot of people are familiar with ruffed grouse and how they'll get on top of a big log and kind of do their sort of mating dance. You can hear them drumming in the spring. But there's a number of birds that will feed in and on down wood, a number of amphibians, salamander species, and insects that will use this downed wood that in turn can become food for birds. So downed wood is very important. You don't want your forest to look like a photo park. You kind of want some messiness associated with your forest. That messiness is oftentimes habitat and bird food. Leaf litter depth can be important for certain species. So how deep the leaf litter, accumulated leaf litter is. Things like earthworms, invasive earthworms can have a huge impact on that and really reduce that leaf litter depth. We're going to move on to the back page now. We're going to look at water, ponds, streams, wetlands. Do we have permanent ponds, lakes, streams? Do we have temporary ponds, things that maybe are only inundated with water for a few weeks in the spring? You might hear spring peepers and wood frogs coming out of them. And by the time August rolls around, especially a dry August and September like we've had, they might be dry. We're going to look at invasive species. So this is just going to be walking around, recognizing them, sort of writing it down. So you can think about some management that you might want to do to sort of eliminate it or reduce it. In this case, we've had some buckthorn that we found in the northeast corner of this site, as well as some seed-bearing trees. So we know it's going to be spreading around the stand if we don't do anything. While you're out there, this is going to be a little bit dependent on the time of the year that you're out there to really catch everything. But if you're there in, say, June, you're probably going to hear a lot of birds. And you can consider using something like the Merlin free app out of, I think that's out of Cornell, that developed that really amazing sound feature. You just basically turn your microphone on and it just starts IDing everything it hears. It has better ears than I do a lot of the times. So I think it's pretty cool. You can also look at other wildlife because birds aren't the only thing that are important in a forest. It needs all the puzzle pieces to really be a functioning system. And also it might inform you, for example, if you see a lot of deer scat, browse seedlings, things like that, you might want to think about how you're going to protect tree seedlings and things like that from browsing deer. And then lastly, the notes, you're going to collect notes on sort of what you see in the general area. So not just your stand, but what's around it. And I think our guidebook has you looking out to something like a mile and to sort of just note what's around it. The idea being that your stand might have elements that aren't around or might have elements that the surrounding areas don't have, making it sort of unique and important in certain ways. But your stand might be deficient in some ways that other adjacent areas are kind of making up for. So you might not have a lot of young forest, for example, but maybe, so in this case, in this sample forest, we might have some grass and pasture to the west, some lowland conifer swamps to the south, maybe a young aspen stand that doesn't have a lot of snags in it necessarily. So all things to think about as you think about what you want to do to your stand. Lastly, at the bottom of this is basically just some reference that will help you while you're in the woods. So you don't have to necessarily cart this book around with you. Ways to sort of measure that tree canopy closure, estimates sort of size of acres, leave trees, and just a summary of some of the more important habitat elements. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully get back to sharing my PowerPoint. And see if I can continue from where I was at. Does everyone see the Northern Hardwood Forest again?
So we're looking at your presentation notes, Christian.
Oh, yes, yes.
The switcheroo. Yep.
Did it again. Okay.
All good.
Okay, I have a few slides left, so I'm going to go fast, so leave a few minutes. But so we did our field work worksheet exercise. We have a northern hardwood stand. And so what we learned was we're in a northern hardwood stand, and the guidebook's going to provide a bunch of information about that we might find interesting and useful. In the guidebook, now that we know that we're in a northern hardwood stand, we can identify that we have two birds of interest in that type. So the wood thrush and the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And from the guidebook, I'll go over this in detail briefly in a second, but you'll be able to pull out those birds' biology, habitat, sort of migration, ID tips, nesting and foraging information, all that stuff that I showed on the sort of Michigan screenshot sample. You'll be able to find about these two bird species that live in this type of forest. Some problem areas we identified from our walkthrough. So we didn't have a lot of snags. I guess I didn't emphasize that, but we did not have a lot of snags at all in our stand. And we did not have a lot of large downed logs in our stand. There's also some heavy shade from a very dense overstory. So the guidebook will help sort of let us know why that's a problem and what we might want to do about it. So maybe we want to create some snags or think about getting some large down logs scattered around that site, and maybe opening up some areas of that stand to provide a little bit more sunlight to that mid and understory and get some of that diversity there, vertical and species diversity. And we also identified we didn't have any conifers in the stand, so we might think about planting some that are suitable for that site. And we have buckthorn. So although the guidebook does not provide invasive species control info, it does provide links to where you can find more information for a given species. So the guidebook would recommend that in this type, you might want to do single tree selection, release your crop trees. Again, we're looking at a sugar bush, so we want big, large crown, healthy maple trees that we can tap for maple syrup. We might want to get some aspen in the stand to girdle some trees, fell others to get some of those snags and down trees. And again, plant conifers, protect them from deer browse. Again, I think we're running out of time, but two birds that represent this site or that are in this forest type are the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So here's some information about it. The Partners in Flight Conservation Concern Score and the Minnesota Species of Greatest Conservation Need both rank this as a bird that's doing relatively well. So they're not a concerned species, and it's a relatively common bird. It's still an important bird. So there's a number of things, and for the interest of time, I'm not going to go through everything, but there's a number of management recommendations you can do to help this bird out. And a wood thrush, which, as you can see from the two red boxes, is a species that is declining and having a hard time. And so we might want to focus our efforts on helping this bird out. The guidebook does say that this type of bird is relatively uncommon in a small 10-acre stand like we have, but we did pick it up when we were doing our walkthrough. So we might want to think about doing some management to help this bird out. And again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over through all the recommendations, but this is the type of thing that you'll find. Last slide. So some key points. So this is overall, this program is not just the guidebook. It's a whole program, hopefully tied to outreach, education, field work, workshops, and things like this webinar. We're hoping to help inform and educate and not just mandate specific management, but ultimately to get people thinking about birds and bird-friendly forestry. That diversity of forest types, species, structure, age, and some other components in a forest are all key to a species diversity. That the forests of Minnesota may only be a part of many birds' lives, so they might just spend a couple months in the summer here, but they are breeding months, and it basically helps determine whether or not this bird species is going to be off to a good start or not. And then again, we want to provide a lot of other resources because we are making one small friendly publication that is going to reference multi-hundred page documents, sometimes articles, very expansive websites and things like that. So a couple areas for more information. There are a couple pages of this in the guidebook that we've developed, so broken down into sort of categories. And with the last few remaining minutes, I will gladly answer any questions. I haven't been monitoring the chat, so
All good, Christian. I can load up some of these or tee up some of these questions for you. That was great. Thank you so much. We do have a comment from Casey in Itasca County. I'm happy to see work like this being done. Aspen coppice forests, about 10 to 30 years of age, seem to have very few birds or other wildlife using them. Question from Caitlin. I think we discussed this in a previous planning meeting. Do you think it'd be possible for the guide to include a QR code or something similar to link to an audio file of the bird call?
yeah, we discussed that. Think we're a little bit on the fence. One of the problems in the internet world is a phenomenon called link rot. This is where websites change and URLs become outdated and dead links. And so, depending on our ability to sort of keep up to date with different versions of this, we risk, if we do put something like that in, we risk dead links somewhere down the road if someone has a copy for a while and we're not able to revise it.
Okay, sure. And another question here, how can we know when this guide is available? Can we get on a notification list? And perhaps I can share attendees' contact info, or what's the next best source here for updates?
Yeah, so we're hoping to have the PDF and hopefully the hard copy by the end of the calendar year. I mentioned that we're just about to start working with the graphic designer. We're sort of in the home stretch here. And so we are hoping to sort of, my goal would be to get the word out via a number of different social media realms, listservs, contacting different groups, Minnesota naturalists, putting it on our website, in a bunch of different areas, distributing it amongst the members of our working group to distribute through their networks and channels. And so I'm actually open to suggestions on the best way to get the word out, but we're definitely going to make an effort to get this out there into the world as widely and quickly as possible into as many hands as there are interested parties.
Great. And with that, if I just pasted a link or kind of a block of text from earlier in the webinar too, if you are not getting SFEC's monthly updates, that might be one way in which this guide could be circulated. And of course, for other updates related to future offerings or the like related to this, because that then kind of tee up my own question here. Will there be a workshop in the near future that folks would be able to attend to kind of dive into this or see it in action, aside from the Samplay forest?
Play, yeah. Yeah, nothing's scheduled yet, but it is 100% on our radar and on our list of intentions to bring this out to a number of different groups, from casual people interested in birds to private landowner groups to professional wildlife managers and foresters. So we're hoping to roll this out in a number of different ways, including field tours and things like that, so we can actually walk around and put this to practice and sort of have some interesting discussions. And it's always interesting to hear the different perspectives, and especially as we go around the state. I think that would be interesting too. So we're hoping to shop this around kind of throughout Minnesota's forested areas, and we'll sort of figure out who we're going to target and how we're going to do that.
Great. Thanks, Christian. And again, I pasted the link if you'd like to request credit for this webinar. Follow that Z link, the Web24 CE. And I see you're right up at 10 a.m. Thanks so much to all of y'all for joining us today and being engaged and chiming in here. There's quite a few links in chat that I tried to post as Christian was going through. So if you have a moment, just kind of scroll back up and take a look at those. Our next webinar is on November 12th. Dr. Marcella Wimmuller-Campioni is going to be talking about kind of a broad range of research that she and her Silva Lab have been working on related to tamarack amidst an ongoing eastern larch beetle outbreak for the last 24 or so years. So keep an eye out for that and future communications for that for November 12th, again at our usual 9 a.m. So thanks again, Christian, and have a great rest of the week, folks. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lane.